proposals. Before I turn to commentary, let me begin first by summarizing a couple of the central arguments of Machiavellian democracy that are close to questions about Machiavellian, about Florentine politics that I study myself. The book takes as its point of departure 2 points about Machiavelli. One, that he was a vocal critic of elite political culture, and the other, that his brand of republicanism insisted on the positive effects of class conflict properly channeled. Rather than using Machiavelli's populism, however, as an explanatory device to illuminate other aspects of Machiavelli's life, his biography, and his writings, Machiavellian democracy reveals that Machiavelli's populism inspired a sustained and a systematic political thought aimed expressly at empowering the people to restrain elites. McCormick shows that Machiavelli's republicanism was particularly obsessed with political problems caused by excessive wealth and caused by substantial disparities in power within a republic's citizenry. Further, McCormick shows that when Machiavelli began to consider how a free people might best protect itself against the tyrannical and ambitious tyranny of its influential citizens, Machiavelli did not think in terms of expanding the people's presence in electoral politics. Somewhat counterintuitively, I would say, for a distinguished contributor to the Republican tradition, McCormick's Machiavelli was not generally interested in figuring out ways to ensure that the less well-off might find ways better to compete for office against their social betters. A striking feature of McCormick's Machiavelli is the degree to which he concedes right at the outset that there simply is no way to prevent elites from dominating electoral politics. It is an immutable fact of political life. Since Machiavelli accepts the presence of what theorists call the aristocratic effect of elections, this is namely the well-documented phenomenon by which open and free elections tend to put plutocrats in power, Machiavelli sought largely non-electoral solutions to these problems, and McCormick focuses on 3 in particular in the book. The first are offices that have legislative veto power from which wealthy citizens are excluded. The second are appointment procedures that rely on lottery and randomization rather than direct election. And the third is the necessity of having major political trials judged by the entire citizenry of a republic. The book, in my view, persuasively demonstrates the degree to which those 3 institutional preferences recur in quite important ways in Machiavelli's political writings. The first point about this that strikes me as somewhat radical and as worthy of reflection is the degree to which Machiavelli's Republican political thought appears to argue that liberty and equality are not mutually compatible, or at least that they tend in different directions. This point becomes pointedly clear in Machiavelli's constitutional proposal for Florence. In that text, Machiavelli suggests creating an executive committee composed of the city's most ambitious and most status-obsessed citizens. These are the automati. They, Machiavelli explains, will not be content unless they have power, for sure, but power accompanied by considerable prestige and status. Looking at Florentine history, Machiavelli concluded that the practice of mingling minor and major guildsmen in the priorate prevented that institution from satisfying the elite's sense of privilege and exclusivity. But rather than championing what I think most populists would probably identify as one of Florence's most admirable, or by the standards of early modern Europe, unique accomplishments, namely the establishment of a political culture where humble artisans could and did rub elbows with the city's patrician notables, Machiavelli instead argued for a system that sated the elite's sense of puffed-up entitlement by excluding the people from sitting on that chief executive council. His ideal council, thus, is unlike any one that actually existed in Florence's past because it formally excluded the non-elite. Hence, as I read it anyway, the normative preferences of McCormick's Machiavelli suggest that he viewed equality as a political problem, something that required management. In an environment in which all citizens can freely compete for admission to a regime's top posts, the fact of economic and social disparity ensures that the elite will always enjoy an advantage, such that the result of electoral politics will always tend to result in oligarchy. Machiavelli has a solution to this, and his solution, as McCormick reads him, is to stimulate both solidarity and animosity in the people's self-awareness. He achieves the first, that is the solidarity, by excluding the people from elite councils and giving them specific magistracies of their own from which the elite are equally excluded. He achieves the animosity by making sure that those people's specific institutions are formally subordinate to the elite institutions. By making them legally subordinate, he hopes to provoke a useful sense of indignation at that subordinate status. In doing so, I would add, I think Machiavelli perhaps wished deliberately to disarm the Republican rhetoric of civic humanism by praising equal hope for office without reflecting on the implications of unequal resources in electoral competitions. Humanism tended to legitimate elite domination of electoral processes while preserving a notional facade of equality. The humanist chancellor Leonardo Bruni famously wrote that in Florence, quote, "the hope of attaining public office is equal to all." I get the sense that Machiavellian democracy wants to see that slippery hope crushed once and for all. Portraying Machiavelli as a Republican critic of political equality is inherently controversial. I can well imagine that some scholars would dispute it. But I would like to suggest here that there's at least one way in which that formulation helps resolve some interpretive dilemmas in Machiavelli scholarship. And I'm referring here to the opening chapter of Book 3 of Machiavelli's Florentine Histories, in which Machiavelli compares Rome and Florence. Great things with little things, as he puts it. And conflicts in Rome, of course, had salutary effects, resulting in good laws and military virtue. Conflicts in Florence had the opposite effect, resulting in discord, chaos, and military impotence. But Machiavelli adds one additional comparison that a number of scholars have puzzled over. That is that Rome's beneficial conflicts brought the city from a state of equality to one of inequality, while Florence's poor squabbles brought the city from a state of great inequality to one of equality. So whatever problems exist in Florence's recent history, as Machiavelli sees it, they're in some way tied to Florence's culture of equality. Scholars seeking to portray Machiavelli as a distinguished exponent of the Republican tradition have a tough time with precisely that passage. Some people ignore it altogether. I don't think you'll find it in any discussion of that in the work of Quentin Skinner or John Pocock. You will find it discussed by Hans Baron, but he acknowledged it as a problem that he could not solve. And in fact, he concluded, Machiavelli never became a steadfast Republican with regard to the practical problems of Florence's future and his own. I think Baron would have particularly appreciated the interpretation advanced in Machiavellian Democracy, since it shows how Machiavelli's seemingly bitter repudiation of the effects of equality was A, part of a larger political theory that sanctioned formal inequality for the sake of greater political strength for the people, and that B, given the way that commentary on equality was linked to immediate questions of constitutional reform, it's evidence of an engaged republicanism, and hence suggests substantial continuities between the discourses in the Florentine histories, and that is a connection that is dear to the Republican tradition. On the other hand, I think that there is a possibility that by defining Machiavelli's chief political concerns in terms of specifically institutional conflict between binary groups of elites and people, one might inadvertently be making the case that Machiavelli's Republican preferences were somewhat outmoded, and more of a nostalgic reflection on past politics in Florence than a direct engagement with current contemporary realities. I say that because Florentine politics in Machiavelli's day and in the century preceding it did not often feature conflicts in which there were clearly defined popular and elite social groups squaring off against each other with clearly defined institutional preferences. There were certainly times in Florence's history when that was the case. The Guild Republicanism, the Primo Popolo, the Ciompi Revolt, there are examples. And certainly, I don't dispute that one major recurring question about Florentine politics in Machiavelli's own day was whether the government should tilt in an aristocratic direction or tilt in a popular direction. But that question was rarely reflected in any direct or obvious institutional way, for the simple reason that most of the conflicting parties tended to straddle class lines in ways that might, I think, withstand the specifically institutional force of Machiavellian democracy. And a couple of examples from Florentine history and from Machiavelli's Florentine histories will help explain what I mean. Remember, one of the principal features here of McCormick's Machiavellian democracy is the fusion of electoral techniques of randomization and sortition with direct voting to offset the aristocratic effect of elections. But if we look at the history of the Republic that Machiavelli served, the implications of those two electoral techniques were initially understood in exactly the opposite way. Now, that is, the first major moment of political reforms that established the post-Medician Republic of 1494 occurred on December 2nd. And at that moment, the Republic was entirely in the hands of the conservative ultimati who had expelled the Medici, and they had done so precisely to establish a narrow aristocracy. They relied heavily in that electoral law of December 2nd on sortition as the principal electoral mode functioning in the Great Council. And they received much criticism from popular forces within the city precisely because of their reliance on sortition, including from Savonarola himself in the sermon of December 13th that argued that direct voting was essential for the popular constitution. So a couple weeks later, on December 23rd, the Ultimati, in a concession to popular forces in the city, redesigned the city's electoral laws to put greater emphasis on voting. Now, it is certainly true that over time, voting did indeed favor the city's elite. By late 1495, it had become completely clear that the system of direct voting was not helping advocates of a more popular regime. So we certainly see the aristocratic effect of elections playing out in a predictable way in 1494, 1495. But I think the fact that that was not initially obvious is revealing of some social and cultural complexities of Florentine Republican politics, which brings me back to the possibility that Machiavelli's that Machiavellian democracy may have been inspired by nostalgia. Central to Machiavelli's constitutional enterprise was the division of offices and of powers according to class and occupation-specific distinctions. Those distinctions were indeed a meaningful aspect of the communal republicanism of the guilds, in which one's membership in a particular guild hierarchy determined one's place in the larger political community. The occupation-specific political conflicts of guild republicanism by the 15th and 16th centuries had been almost entirely superseded by conflicts between rival patronage networks, few, if any, of which had specifically single-class affiliations. Almost every faction in the Republic of Machiavelli's day straddled class lines and included distinguished members of the Ultimati, who were clearly disinclined to act as a unified group. Consider the dominant factional alignments of Machiavelli's early Republican years. There were four major groups, understood as pairs of opposites. There were the Greys and the Whites, those who wished to see the Medici return to power, those who had formally and openly committed to the new republic. There were supporters of Savonarola and opponents of Savonarola, the whiners and the angry ones. These were four kind of separate groups that occasionally at times overlapped, but each of those four groups was led by a core of Ultimati, and although they did all share in a general way support for a closed or more narrow oligarchy, they rarely worked together in pursuit of that objective because they were simply too preoccupied with factional rivalries that were not organized principally around class. Foreign policy was a divisive issue, religion was a divisive issue. Savonarola introduced all manner of, what might say, cultural factors into the situation. And the Savonarolan party itself, I think, is a particularly good example. It was indeed the principal champion of broad-based popular republicanism. But nevertheless, it was led by some of the very oligarchs who had expelled the Medici in the first place in an attempt to establish an aristocratic regime. The principal political leader of the Savonarolans was Francesco Valori, ostensibly the voice of a popular party, but someone who was a very divisive figure because he was a bullying, a domineering, antagonistic kind of individual. Exactly the perfect prototype for Machiavelli's conception of a noble, an arrogant noble. He had extra constitutional clout in the Florence of his day because he was backed by a popular party. But the politics, in a way that at times they wound up supporting, looked a lot like the politics of Machiavelli's bullying elites. To conclude on a universal rather than a particular note, I think this preceding Florentine example is merely one variation of a broader pattern of change connected to the rise of the modern state. Like almost every European polity between the Middle Ages and the early modern era, Florence changed from a sprawling, pluralistic political community to a sovereign state in this period. And that transition, more than anything else, spelled the end of the guild republicanism that championed the kind of class and occupation-specific political categories that seemed so central to Machiavellian democracy. All centralizing states tend to take a dim view of legal and political distinctions between their subjects. So whether in Florence or elsewhere, in a political context where the power of corporate and family bonds were declining, informal and extra-institutional patron-client relationships expanded in scope and expanded in power. Because those patronage groups were structured vertically, they all contained their own upper, middle, and lower classes. And for that reason, I think their political conflicts and their rivalries are perhaps not best managed or interpreted primarily in terms of the binary analysis of popular containment of elite aggression.